once the data is merged in and migrated or converted into the new payroll here, your opening screen will look like this. To add deductions and allowances, we have to go up here to Data Setup in the upper left corner. And then below that, we've got employees, contractors, departments, and right across the top, we see the options called allowances and deductions, okay? So one of the wonderful new features in the version 24 is we have added some pre-constructed allowances and deductions. So things that are commonly used like housing allowance or health savings account allowance, group term life allowances, those are going to be systematically added as part of Church Windows. And we've got similar deductions that are pre-constructed in the version 24 Church Windows as well that will be pre-constructed for you. Again, anything that references deduction, group term life deductions, health savings account, and pension 403B. Those are the ones that the software is going to, upon installation, any new installation of the payroll module or Church Windows will install those systematically. Now, please be assured that any of the deductions or allowances that are currently set up or in your current payroll data will be brought in and brought into the new version 24 payroll as part of the conversion process. If you would like to be able to see what that's going to look like, the conversion, the installation, the conversion, and then a discussion about the new payroll security features or functionality in the new version 24, please feel free to join us for tomorrow's webinar event on the conversion and security in payroll. Okay, that was the one that was postponed from earlier this month and has now been rescheduled for tomorrow. That now works as it will and should, and that will go off as planned tomorrow at 1 p.m. So please feel free to log in and register for that. It will too be recorded, but if you are available and can, please join us for that. Okay. So deductions and allowances that are been used, and this is a really important feature. So right here, we're seeing a series of deductions that Church Windows has created by the installation process for version 24, as well as the ones that were converted in when we brought in payroll data from our old separate payroll program, okay? So one of the important things, and again, I think most of this makes complete sense when you think about it, but it's just important that we make sure that it's completely understood with detail, is that as soon as a deduction or an allowance has been used, it cannot be deleted, okay? So right here, this first one that we have highlighted called Group Term Life Deduction, that's one that the installation created. It has not been used because the delete button above it is now available. But if I go down to something like, dental insurance down here, we notice that delete now becomes unavailable. Why? Because that was used in our old payroll program, when it was separate from Church Windows, and it has a history that the software is hanging on to, an audit trail essentially, okay? So as soon as you post something to an allowance or a deduction, for the time being at least, you're stuck with that, okay? If you decide that you're going to delete historic payroll data, I believe that, as it is with everywhere in the software, is that when you delete the final payroll transactions and employees where that was posted, then you would be able to come in here and delete those deductions or allowances, okay? And the deduction and the allowances work or function the exact same way. So right here, again, I'm clicking on each one of them, and we can clearly see delete is not available on some of them because, again, they were used in our old payroll database. So again, here's also verification that the deductions and allowances that were in our previous database are there. So please rest assured, if you have deductions and allowances that you have set up in your current payroll, those will be converted and brought in here, and they will still be assigned to your employees and everything else, okay? At the top left, a date range. So what this means is basically we can see deduction, allowance, details, totals, and employees information for different periods by simply changing the date range, okay? And what I mean by that is when we go over to the Totals tab here in the upper right, we're going to come back to details in just a minute, but right here it shows me, okay, here's my pension totals for 2022 because that's what my date range is, okay? So it shows I've had $390 in January and February for pension deductions for my employees, and then it shows me each one with a grand total in the bottom right. That is also then confirmed with that same 403b pension deduction by clicking on the Employees tab. So when I click on Employees, it actually shows me the employees where the 403b pension has been, for whom that's been actually deducted, and what their grand totals are. So while there is no total here, the amount that is the total of these 4 employees does equal the grand total that's listed down here under the Totals tab. Okay. And really the bottom line was how I was trying to tie that to the date range is I can just change the year right here if I want to look at, say, deductions for a previous period. So right here, I've got my minus year. You see that minus year plus year right below my applied dates and left to the right of the date range. So if I want to go back to 21, I simply click minus year. Here are my deductions for that year. And now when I go to, say, my employees and I click on it, here are my deductions and my totals either by employee or totals only for that particular period. So if all I want to do is look at a particular employee's or period's deductions for a period, I do not need to go to a report anywhere else. I can come right into the deductions or allowances file, and that information by month or grand total or by employee is right there at our fingertips at any time. Don't have to go and run a report. I can, but I don't have to. So if I've got a simple, I'm interested in finding out, hey, how much was, deducted, for pension in February of 2021, I just go right here. There it is, $390.68. Okay. So, and again, allowances, folks, work the same way. So let me go close out of our deductions and go up to allowances. So again, when I click on something like housing, I have similar details, totals, and employee tabs where I can see, again, got a date range option. I can click minus year, plus year, and I can choose it, and I can see details, totals, or employee totals for a particular period. Okay? So again, virtually identical in terms of how these work. We're going to go back to deductions. There's a reason why here. Okay? To add a deduction or an allowance, again, the functionality is the same in both windows. I simply click the Add button right here in the middle. Should see that to the right of my delete button and above my first deduction here. I click add and notice it now adds a new deduction with a start date and waiting for me to enter a description. Okay. So let's see a good, sorry, I meant to say also that the start date here as I'm adding the deduction right here, because then notice that's where that's kind of highlighted, is it's going to default to the first day of the payroll year. So in this case, there is no fiscal year in payroll. It's all calendar year because that's what your employee's tax year supports, and your tax documents. But I can set that start date to any date I want. Okay. So that's important. I mentioned this in one of the earlier webinars is notice it also has an end date. Now that, notice it says in parentheses, is optional. And you have this again under allowances as well. Okay. So you can have a start date without an end date, but you got to have a start date. Okay. So some folks might be going, well, when do I maybe want to have an end date entered? And that's a really great question. So an example of that, and I deal with this on my support calls a lot of times, is maybe the church has lent, advanced, an advance of their pay or lent an employee money, and an employee is now repaying the church in the form of a deduction. Okay. So let's say that we haven't calculated our first pay of October, and we're basically going to set the start date for the deduction as, say, 10/1/2022, and it'll end on 12/31. Our agreement with the employee is that the loan will be paid before or by the final pay of 2022. And here I'm going to set up a deduction, and I'm going to call it employee loan deduction. Okay. And I think I saw a question there in terms of taxable status. Also, folks, description abbreviation. This is a required or mandated field. Okay. The reason being is because the description abbreviation will show on, like, say, the W-2 if the full description itself, if there's not if the full description is too long to fit on there. So maybe we'll just put in something like, ELD, employee acronym for employee loan deduction. Frequency, every pay. Of course, you've got the option for all of these: every pay, every other pay, twice a month, first pay of the month, second pay of the month, quarter, first pay, quarterly, end quarter. So in this case, we would leave it as E. Again, you've got the option for your W-2 boxes, 10, 12, or 14. Again, depending on the number you choose, you are required to choose a box code. 10 clearly doesn't require one, but 12 does. And here you've got all of the available codes that are available to you. And of course, 14 does not have a code requirement. But in this case, a loan to an employee would not need to show separately on the W-2. So we would leave that as none. Include in W-2 wages, folks. And the reason why I'm showing this here under deductions is because the same behavior is true for allowances as well. So one of the things this has been in our software for a long time, is the term include in W-2 wages is synonymous with the term taxable. And the reason being why we call it include in W-2 wages, not taxable, is because Church Windows Payroll supports not only pay for lay staff, lay employees, but also clergy. And many times clergy are not withholding taxes, ministers are not, but they do want to report, or we do have to report certain monies, whether they're deductions or allowances, as part of their federal reported or Social Security, Medicare, state, or local wages. Well, maybe in ministers, not Social Security and Medicare, but certainly federal, state, local, etc. Okay? So in this particular case, the employee loan deduction is absolutely considered taxable, so we're going to leave all of those boxes checked, and we would simply click OK. You do have an option to print your deduction information if you wish down here at the bottom, okay? And then once you've added the deduction, we're going to simply click OK through that, okay? So again, I just want to point out that when we go back into allowances up here and I click Add, it opens up again a place to enter a start date. End date is optional, but you do have a description and a description abbreviation that are both required, with the same controls for frequency, for W-2 box, with the exception, of course, allowances only would be 12 or 14. There is no box 10 for allowances. And taxable or include in W-2 wage controls, okay? So just FYI, that's why, these screens are really similar in terms of how they function. They do in the current payroll software, okay? So when you go into allowances and deductions in Payroll 2022 SR5 right now, you go to the allowances or deductions, you're going to see these same exact things. They're just under two different screens, just like this is. But the controls are virtually identical, okay? So folks, again, we remind you that I'm not a qualified tax professional. None of my techs are. Typically, we may be able to answer some of these questions in terms of the appropriate setup for you. We may not. You may have to contact somebody who's qualified to answer some of those questions regarding proper taxable setup of that. We do have helpful information out on our Resource Center page with some useful and helpful information, and we are trying to be able to get more involved in that by entering some of these deductions and allowances, but we may not be able to answer those at all time. At any time, okay, at all times, I mean. So let's go ahead and say, let's click on something here. Oh, it's asking me, do I want that? And I'm going to have to go, you know what? I'm not entering an allowance. I'm going to try clicking delete here. Oh, it looks like it's requiring me to enter something. There we go. Learn something new about it. Now I can click delete, and it'll say, are you sure you want to delete whatever I'd entered? We're going to click yes, and that's now gone, okay? Okay, so let's click on something and click print. Click print, opens up allowance report options, click print, and it generates the report. So yeah, it brings up the list of the entire report of my allowances here. Let me zoom in on that a little bit. So it shows for 2022 what its setup is, how often it is, if it's W-2 box, if there's a code. True, false equates to checked or unchecked. True is taxable, false is not taxable, is non-taxable. Also shows a start date on these if applicable, and if there's an end date. Of course, we don't have any on our old deductions and allowances that we have in our old software because we didn't have an end date option. That's new in version 24, okay? So once you do enter those end dates, then they will print on this report as well. Finally, with about 2 or 3 minutes left, we're going to now go in and enter our employee loan deduction now to an employee. So if we now go back to data setup and employees contractors in the upper left or employee contractors here in the center, okay, then we're going to go right here and we're going to uncheck contractors. I'm going to go here. Our custodian, Jimmy Hilliard, we lent him money and he's now agreed to have that money deducted for between now and the end of the year. This is important, folks, because right here under the deductions, I'll add that here, okay? But I also need to know because how often he's paid. So we have to visit the Pay Rates and Hours tab to go, okay, semi-monthly. So that tells me that we've got 6 pay periods between now and December 31st. So if say we lent Jimmy $300, we have to take the $300, divide that by 6, then that becomes the amount per deduction that winds up being deducted from his next 6 checks, okay? So you do have to get involved and may have to do a little math on this to make these types of things work. But now we're going to go to the Deductions tab. I click right here. I then click down, go down to the bottom. There's my employee loan deduction. It asks at what date will this start. In this case, that should have brought that in, but it didn't. I'm not torn up about that. So I'm going to enter it as 10/1, okay? And notice it does have an end date of 12/31/2022, okay? I can enter a percent here or an amount. Again, you've got it there, every pay, okay? So right here is where I would key in the $50 per pay, okay? And right over here on the right is where I would choose the account that would be crediting when I deduct that and I transfer that pay into my accounting module. So let's click in there again, and then I click Save, okay? So I would have to go in there and choose that. I'm unsure why it's not showing me those accounts, folks, but it should be showing me that account number right there that I want to have that credit whenever I post that in there. So now when I did post Jimmy's next 6 paychecks, the $50 will come out systematically and the deduction will stop automatically after December 31st of 2022. Doesn't mean it'll remove it from here per se. It just will stop and stop taking out the $50 per pay. Okay? And I did have to save. Okay? Allowances, folks, are done in exactly the same manner. I simply highlight them here. I choose it. I enter the amount and the frequency, and I choose the account that's going to debit for that. Okay? Not too terribly much. When an employee no longer has a deduction or allowance should be on their record, we can come in here and notice here it says unknown allowance from 2005. I go, oh, I don't want those. I can highlight that and remove that. Okay? I'm not deleting any data from their employee file, anything that was posted. I'm simply removing it from their pay record so that doesn't either add into their check or it doesn't come out of their check. And again, I have to click Save. Okay? All right. Well, that is where we are going to leave our topic today.